This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
Peggy Sue Got Married, Round Midnight. What do these three films have in common? Well, they all feature music on their soundtrack, but more important, they appear on either Roger or my 10 Best Films of 1986 list, the annual right of critics nationwide. I'm Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune.
And I'm Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times.
And I'm Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast, here with my co-hosts,
Justin Henson from the Movie Wire Podcast.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts, Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire, are here to take you back to the balcony. Justin, how you doing?
Good, buddy. How are you?
Great. There's a lot of fun doing a little change up of our routine. We have been doing movie after movie after movie, and then a few weeks ago we did our version of our Oscars special, where we talked about their memo to the Academy of 1999. And by far, man, that was our most popular episode. So it had the most YouTube views, it had the most downloads. So I think that we should do our listeners a favor and do more episodes like that, where we take a break from the film critiques and jump into some of those special episodes they did, whether it was the best of a certain year or the worst of a certain year. And of course, when it's Oscar season, the memos to the Academy, or if we pick the winners episodes. Sound like a plan?
Love that. And since we didn't dress up this time, we'll know if it was a suits last time. But, these specials are great because when Siskel and Ebert aired their best, I look forward to that more than I did the award show, because their opinions mattered more than a big army of the Hollywood elites voting for their own clans. So to me, this one really speaks high levels for what I look forward to each and every year.
Well, and here's the other thing too. Like, once I started getting into more of these special episodes, I just kind of got a fix for it. And I just been watching episode after episode of their best of and their worst of, because they actually talked about films that they didn't necessarily cover in their regular show. Like, there were episodes where they didn't even talk about some of these films because they felt they weren't worthwhile talking about in their 30-minute show, but they would save them for the worst of episodes. Now, their best ofs, maybe they did talk about it on the regular program, but they didn't spend as much time with the picture. And it was in these episodes, man, where how we've been kind of criticizing them for they only watched the movie once. They didn't go back and watch it multiple times. But when you watch these episodes, you find out that they actually did go back and review some of their films several times over for these special episodes. So you'll actually get, in my opinion, a better review and justification of why they like these movies with a little bit more insight than you would on the original program that the review first started on, right?
100%, because even when they have the same movie on both their lists, that's where we get into almost an extended cut of their original 3.5 minute review. So we get an extended of the why this deserves to be the best, because both of these guys probably have 20 movies they have to narrow down to their top 10 list, and they have to really be on point to the why. Why did they add this instead of movie B? So to me, I think they're a lot more thought out. They've gotten a lot more views from it. So, and I think we get a better interpretation between the two of them of what these movies meant for that year.
And here's the other thing about these special episodes as well. It's an interesting look into the history of cinema, especially in our lifetime, the 80s and the 90s. If there's one message that they keep putting out in the 80s, it's that they weren't really impressed with a lot of the cinema of the 80s. They were so admirable of the 70s, of New Hollywood, and of the films of the late 60s, that once the 80s and the blockbuster generation kind of came around, they were very cynical about what Hollywood was putting out. That's when you get a lot of salty comments from both Gene and Roger about, oh, another remake. Oh, why can't we do anything original in Hollywood? Why are we just going after special effects? It makes me wonder if the 80s actually kind of ruined them for a while. And then when you watch their episodes of the early 90s to mid 90s, you see them both get excited about cinema again because they saw people being daring and adventurous. And I never really thought of that. Like, I've always been a 90s and 70s guy. And for me, the 80s were just full of guilty pleasures, right? Like, there's good cinema from the 80s, but the ones that really stick with me are my guilty pleasure ones, the ones that I grew up with. And when you watch these episodes, you're like, wow, there really wasn't a whole lot of top tier cinema. And when you did get one, it stood out even more because the rest of the films that came out around it were just kind of popcorn fodder. They were just there to earn a buck in the theater or do big on home video. They weren't there to really like make a statement like 70s and 90s cinema did. At least that's my opinion. And the more I've been watching these guys, I feel it was their opinion too.
The 80s was either art house or it was a lot of stuff just being pumped out. Because if we remember the 80s and the 90s, this is where we can open up the newspaper and we would have 4, maybe 5 new releases each week if we're lucky. And even Siskel and Ebert during the 80s and 90s, they said it themselves, interview after interview. We see 90% bad and 10% good. And it's an accurate ratio because you have a lot of these. The 80s and 90s, I think, were in my opinion, the starting point to studios really pumping out movies for those dollar signs, not for the art, not for making a name for the studio, but just for the dollar signs. And we saw a lot of garbage in the 80s and 90s, and some of those are guilty pleasures, but there are some that have just gotten forgotten. And in respect to critics of the 80s and 90s, they had to sit through a lot of these movies. And in some cases, if we read a lot of Gene Shalit's books or even Ebert's books, it becomes almost exhausting at a point. And we've talked about it before where they walk into a movie and that passion from a bad movie trickles into the good movie. And that's the challenge of a critic in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s to a point.
So we're going to pepper these episodes through our movie review episodes, and we'll do some best ofs and some worst of. And we were going to take turns in deciding what year and what subject we were going to cover. And since it was my idea, I started, and I chose the best of 1986. And I went through all the years of the 80s and 90s of looking at their films of their best of. And the reason why I picked 1986, it's because it's a year where I feel it was the division point of where the 80s turned from, let's say, art house and the birth of the blockbuster to just utter cinema nonsense from 87 to 1990, where it's like, okay, now we're just going to do all sequels. Now we're just going to do all licensed properties and intellectual properties, right? It really kind of just turned after 1986. So the way I look at it, and I think the way they look at it too, is 1986 was like that last year where, let's say, art house filmmakers stayed art house filmmakers before they started taking paychecks, before they started making big budget studio productions. And I think it was just a really interesting year of cinema, and their list is so varied. It's such an interesting list, and they're both very individual between the two of them. There's some where it's like, that's on their top 10 of 1986. And then there's films where I couldn't believe they're not on either list, but we'll save that for the end. So how about we start with the very first one that they bring on.
Paul Mazursky's Down and Out in Beverly Hills. This one told the story of a bum who jumped into the swimming pool of a rich Beverly Hills couple one morning and stayed to take control of their lives, their families, even their whole neighborhood.
Okay, so Down and Out in Beverly Hills. Paul Mazursky's comedy starring Nick Nolte and Richard Dreyfuss and Bette Midler. This was one of those films that they started feeling comfortable of making fun of the bourgeoisie of California, right? Where it's like in the late 70s and early 80s, you had lifestyles of the rich and famous. These people were held up on pedestals, like everyone wanted to be them. And then it would take, industry cynicists like Paul Mazursky to write a script that really showed how fragile these people really are. And I mean, Buñuel kind of did it with the Charm of Bourgeoisie. Like, that was French, but it was kind of the same take on it. This is like the American version. And I think that this is one of the best movies of the 80s because it allowed people to start making fun of the rich and famous and not just idolizing them.
There's nothing funnier than making fun of people that are richer than you and doing it for an hour and 45, 2-hour runtime. I mean, this movie, and Roger even says it doesn't stop. You have all these characters with all these quirks, with especially Little Richard in it as well, that kind of just pokes fun. So there is a lot of good stuff from start to finish, and it's hard to pinpoint in this movie a bad scene. It's hard to pinpoint something that's not entertaining. And when we look at the top 10 movies, that's kind of the definition of, personally, when you're creating a top 10, what you want to look for is something that really resonates with you, that you have trouble just kind of cherry picking negatives out of it. And I think this is a brilliant, brilliant pick by Ebert. It almost reminds me of when they picked Kingpin one year for Best Picture. So it's out of left field. And this one, I think, out of his entire list, is probably one of the most honest when it comes to a movie that really, well, second, I'm not going to get ahead of myself. Second, when it comes to a movies that really resonated with him, that he was honest and up for it about, because this movie wasn't on a ton of top 10 lists with critics. And no. I think it's a fantastic pick by Ebert.
And it's such an Ebert pick too, because like the dude liked to laugh. The dude liked comedy, where we both know that Gene was a little bit more particular about what he found funny. We talked about it in the Ghostbusters episode, where he wanted the joke to be written funny more than he wanted it to be delivered funny. Let's hear what he had to say about the film.
This movie was hilarious from beginning to end. A savagely funny look at a level of consumption so conspicuous that even the dog in that family has its own psychiatrist. And we ought to mention the dog too, I suppose. His name is Mike, and he gave one of the best supporting performances of the year. I'd love to see him on the Academy Awards. I don't know who his co-host would be.
Yeah, and we have to mention Mike the dog. Like, he plays Matisse the dog. And Mike the dog was in a bunch of stuff in the 80s. I remember him being on the Edison Twins back in the 80s on the Disney Channel. I also want to say that he was in that show with Corky, Life Goes On. He was like the dog. Like, I remember there was a contest too where you could meet Mike the dog. Like, he was kind of a minor celebrity in the 80s, but the fact that tickled Roger's funny bone, it really makes me happy, because I think in many circumstances this movie would end up on other people's not top 10 lists, but like, oh, this was a funny movie. But to put this a bunch above a lot of other movies that came out in 1986, like, that's impressive.
Well, one, you put a dog in it, Ebert, you already got points with Ebert, so he loves his dog movies. But what's really enjoyable about listening to him is when he's laughing, describing it. And you can tell that's where the passion comes through in his reviews, is he's visualizing these jokes. He's visualizing the movie as he's describing it. And there's nothing more joyous than hearing passion come through the delivery of a critic's review, especially a comedy where he's physically laughing while telling another human about this film.
Yeah, you don't get to see him laugh that often so cheerfully, so it's a lot of fun. All right, so then we move on to Gene's pick.
Our next film is number 10 on my list, David Cronenberg's The Fly, a horror film, and that's a rarity to find on a 10 best list, because 10 best lists usually are filled with more noble pictures, but there was, if you think about it, a certain nobility to The Fly, the nobility of an inquisitive scientist experimenting with moving massive particles of matter, like a human body, from one place to another.
I was so shocked that he had The Fly on his top 10 list, because he wasn't really that big of a fan of like gross out body horror or mean movies or gross movies. And this might be one of the grossest movies of the 80s, or at least mainstream gross out movies of the 80s. But he's right. It's the humanity and then the loss of humanity of the movie that Cronenberg really portrays in his film, and Goldblum really portrays in his performance, where like Goldblum normally is that quirky guy that everyone kind of likes. And here we see him tormented for 90 minutes as he's just losing all of his hair and all of his, bodily functions and essentially his spirit. Yet there still is that romantic connection that they talk about between he and Gina Davis. Like, for a horror movie, it's also just a very beautiful and tragic love story. And the fact that it's on the top 10 of his was shocking, but impressive.
It's a love story that's rejected by society. And I think, to me, this was, again, a shock that this was on Gene's list, because we've heard his reviews time and time again about ugly films, grotesque films. And this one, I think, was between Ebert and Siskel. This was their gimme. This is, have fun with these two picks. This is going to be the bottom of your pick. But Goldblum, his breakout role, this was one of his that really made this movie. It was written for Goldblum and his quirkiness.
Yeah.
And they talk about it in the review where Gene doesn't even like sci-fi because he doesn't buy into it. But this makes it realistic. So there's some realistic elements out of this, and that includes the human nature between the relationship and the love story, even though there is some grotesque to it, but there is some personality traits between the two of chemistry and relatability. So I think all the elements that he's speaking to, I think it makes sense to me. And I think, to me, this would be on my top 10 for that year, because I love The Fly, because I think there's so many good things. Taking out the special effects and the grotesque nature of it, I think a lot of the other elements outpower that when it comes to visuals and storytelling.
That's Gina Davis as his girlfriend, and she and Goldblum, despite his disgusting makeup, develop a genuine love affair on screen. The movie is beautifully made without passing into what I call the gross-out category, and so what we get from The Fly is both a great adventure and a fine love story.
So yeah, he totally nailed exactly what you just said, is that, yeah, if we're discussing as some of the things that they show you visually, it is that love story, and it is that, I don't know, the analogy that people always talk about is this was David Cronenberg's kind of thought piece of the AIDS epidemic, right? Where like people were watching loved ones essentially rot away from a disease that couldn't be cured, that couldn't be fixed. Cronenberg even said, like, yeah, that's kind of what it is about, but the media and word of mouth made it a bigger deal than I really was trying to make it. It wasn't necessarily just an AIDS allegory. It just kind of played to the idea of like losing oneself to a disease, to a state of decay, and what the people who love you do to try and save you or comfort you. And in this case, you end up destroying yourself or them. Yeah, and it's a beautiful movie, and that's one that we could like literally sit and talk about for an hour, but that's not what this episode is about.
Yeah, and again, another time, another place for it, but I think when it comes down to it, I think this one was, to an extent, overlooked. It did get a nomination, I think, for Best Visual Effects or Best Makeup, I believe, at the Oscars. But I think this one was completely overlooked on performance and picture, even though it doesn't fit into the noir of Best Picture, but I think it was completely overlooked.
Our next film on our 10 Best of 86 show comes from my list. It's number 8, and it's the year's best love story, in my opinion. Children of a Lesser God, billed as a film about the deaf, but the issue of deafness played a minor role in my appreciation of this passionately made and beautifully acted movie. Randa Hames, making her feature film debut as a director, an impressive one, employed William Hurt and newcomer Marlee Matlin to tell the story of a teacher of the deaf falling in love with a stubborn deaf woman.
So this is a very interesting pick for him, because Roger will say it in a second, we'll play his segment. This is one of those movies that like I've seen once, and once was enough, because it just wasn't made for me. Like it had its audience was not me. Marlee Matlin won the Oscar that year. I'm going to say well-deserved for what she does, but it was also very controversial because it was like a performance that no one had ever seen before, so people didn't really know how to judge it or weigh it against the other nominees that year. And in some ways, people just kind of pass it over like it never even happened. So it's an interesting take on that. And it's funny that we just talked about William Hurt a few episodes ago about, him in One True Thing, where there are certain roles and performances that seem to be written just for him. And I feel this is one of those. Like his delivery, his performance, his patois, so to speak, is so underplayed that it actually works well with the way Matlin does her performance. You can't have a very bombastic or flamboyant person in that role. You need someone to underplay it so it matches the level of this actress who's not using words but sign language. What are your thoughts on this one? Were you a fan of this one?
I wasn't. It was kind of a one and done for me too. When it comes to Hurt and Matlin, I think the chemistry was there, but to me, I wasn't a fan of Hurt's performance because I think it's just William Hurt doing William Hurt, only in
Right.
a different character. So wasn't a standout performance. Again, we just talked about Jeff Goldblum, and I can think of a few other performances that year that kind of deserved that category, but there was nothing here for me, at least. And I get it. Some people might have related to the character. Some might have been bought in and mistaken the chemistry for a single performance. I get it. But for me, I didn't see anything different from Hurt other than a different character portrayal of Hurt being Hurt.
Right. 100%. Just him being him. And Roger definitely has some thoughts on this.
Sexy, yes. Passionate, romantic, yes. Well acted by Hurt and Matlin, yes. But
That's
deafness,
a lot of yeses.
no. Deafness is simply window dressing in this movie, and it would have been so much more interesting to me if the movie itself had involved the audience in the issue of deafness, instead of having Hurt read everything. And there's a lot of sign language in the movie that
Roger.
deaf people in the audience can't see. It seemed to me that, therefore, they're simply getting a free ride on that issue.
Well, Roger, all I can tell you is that you agree with every point that I make, and even
I didn't quite agree with every point.
every
you
point
made.
except
No,
one, which is the one that I say is the least,
crucial
and I say it's the least important one, which is what's up on the screen. There are two people, very strong, very bright, and very much in love, and very tentative about it. She more than him. And I'll tell you, there aren't a lot of love stories made. It's the most undermade category of film, and this one got to me.
Yeah. So I'm on Team Roger on this one too. I'm not going to be as cruel as he is about saying that the deafness was just window dressing. You could literally put any type of disability in that particular movie and it'll still work. But yeah, the idea that you really are paying more attention to the differences of these people's abilities than you really are their love and their performance. I think that Gene was just really looking at the fact that this was a differentiator of Love Story, right? Because you know him. He loves a good love story. And since he had never seen anything like this before, and it's well made and well acted, that was enough for him to put it on his top 10 list to be daring, saying, hey, we want more love stories that just aren't, Romeo and Juliet or Ali McGraw and Ryan O'Neal, right? Like, we need something a little bit different. I think that's why he championed it so much, where Roger's looking at it more logically, like I think I would, in the sense of like, okay, you can like it, but is it really top 10 best?
And that's the thing. It's kind of like what we talked about, Simon Birch. It's designated for a certain
Oscar bait.
Yeah, a certain element. And I think to an extent, Roger is right. Again, I won't be that cruel, but to an extent, it is a little bit like window dressing. I mean, if we take a look at a comparison, and I know fast forward, but we look at 2021's Coda that I think did it a lot better when it comes to
a lot better,
way better when it comes to looking at the whole picture of it. And we see a lot of the emotion come from how characters interact, not just throwing a love story in with a disability, but rather demonstrating the overcomes, the outcomes. But this definitely, to me, is not top 10 material. So this one, like you, I'm 110% with Roger on this one.
My next choice was number 5 on my list of the year's 10 best films, and I think this one was the one that got away in 1986, the most unfairly overlooked sleeper of the year. The name of the movie was Lucas, and it was a wonderful film, the story of a teenage runt who's smarter than anybody else in school, but he just doesn't fit in. He gets a crush on a new girl in town, but then she falls for the football captain, and then, here's the twist, the football hero also likes this little kid.
Now, that was a surprise, too. Like, just as I was surprised that Children of a Lesser God ended up in the top 10, dare I say that I was more surprised that Lucas ended up on a top 10 list, especially Rogers. What about you, man?
This one, when I saw the list, I think I texted you right away. I finding that interesting. But to me, after digesting it a little bit, and I did rewatch it, is it top 10? No. But, well, I wouldn't say that far top 10. For me, it wouldn't be top 10. But we look at it, and I'm thinking about it. Roger is probably in his early 40s at this point. I think this is his midlife crisis really coming out.
Oh, yeah.
Because he does talk about it in his review where there is a relatability to it. I know just last year I reviewed Are You There, God Is Me, Margaret, and there's no way people probably give me shit for that because that is on nobody's top 10 list, but it is a sweet movie, it's an emotional movie, and it does cover topics that are very relatable. And it's sometimes hard to push that emotion out of the review to say, I love this movie, I related to this movie so much, there is no way I can sleep at night knowing that I loved it so much and I can't share it to the world in my top 10. Does it deserve number 5? Probably not on my list, but I can see where he's going. And Lucas is a sweet movie. Don't get me wrong. It is full of heart. And I think to their point, we all have been there at some point.
Yeah. And well, it also sounds like Lucas is essentially him looking in a mirror. Like he's looking at that movie. He's like, oh, that's my childhood. You can really tell that when he starts kind of debating it with Gene.
Well, I think your praise is a little extreme here. I like the performance by Corey Haim. I like his character, and I like the woman. I thought the football captain was almost unnecessary. I would have preferred to have much more of it be just the girl that he can't have, but who likes him. And so that this kid does learn the difference between liking and loving, and that loving will eventually come along the way.
But Gene, in high school, what always happens is that the one that you have a crush on, if you lose them to somebody else.
Right.
And then so you have that double whammy where it's not enough that you don't have the girl, somebody else has the girl. And that kind of...
I'm familiar with the problem.
I'm sure you are. Yes, we've both been through that. And so that's why I think the football captain is so necessary. There has to be a third member of this triangle.
Okay, make him a third member. Make it an isosceles triangle. Isn't that the one that's nice and skinny? Yeah. In other words, make him a little point and broaden out the base of them.
Well, if only screenwriting were done on the basis of
geometry
and geometry, we'd have a great movie there.
I think it's funny that their most lengthy piece of discourse during this whole episode was over Lucas.
Well, and this is where you can really tell that this was a personal choice for Roger.
Personal choice, right?
Because he would land on the sword for this movie in this argument. And again, piece of it is probably just to argue, but you can tell ending that conversation, the irritation on it, that you're not just attacking this movie, you're attacking me when it comes to how I'm relating to this movie. So there's a little bit of subconscious relatability when it comes to him defending not the movie, but Roger itself to an extent.
I think that's where they had a very interesting dynamic because Gene didn't really do that often. He didn't take the attacks as personal. He was a lot more, I'm going to say, logical and statistical about how he would defend a movie that he liked. And he would just use simple references or mathematical equations of his head of like, okay, well, I'm going to connect it to this movie and this movie and this movie, which are considered classics, and that's going to be my way of defending it. In a sense, we heard him do that with All That Jazz, where he did not deny that, yeah, it's very similar to 8.5, but good, that's what it's supposed to be. Where Roger was a little bit more like, well, why is Fosse having to rip off someone else? And he's like, he's not. He's literally taking that formula that works so well with that particular style of film, and he's doing it with song and dance. Like, he was using that logic to defend why he enjoyed All That Jazz, and he does that with most of his reviews, where, like you said, Roger's a little bit more defensive. It's like, how dare you attack my preference? How dare you attack my personal joy on this top 10 list?
I love the fact that we bring up geometry when we're talking about like a high school romance, and that's the argument we're going after.
Right? Hilarious.
4 on my list of the year's best films was Sid and Nancy, the story of Sid Vicious of the infamous British rock group named the Sex Pistols. Here he is on Paris television, and of his girlfriend, an American named Nancy Spungen. For a brief time in the mid-1970s, they lived high in the spotlight of fame, and then they crash-landed into a nightmare of drug addiction. Their story symbolizes the alienation of a whole generation of young people in London, and the movie was almost uncanny in its ability to capture the disorganized daily lives of its two self-destructive heroes.
All right, so I'm a Sid and Nancy fan through and through. For the most part, I'm an Alex Cox fan through and through. There's a couple of his I'm not super fond of, but Sid and Nancy, man, like, it gave us Gary Oldman. It brought him to the world's attention. I think it brought the name Sid Vicious to a crowd of people that maybe didn't know who he was until they saw the movie. and then got into punk rock and got into the Sex Pistols and such and such. I've always loved this movie. I've always been a punk rock guy, and I love the fact that they give such appreciation later to Chloe Webb, who I think is one of our most underrated and underappreciated actresses of the 80s. She didn't get a lot in the 90s, which is sad, but they're perfectly cast in this role. If I had one complaint about this movie is that it's the movie that gave us Courtney Love. So I don't know, give or take on that one. What are your thoughts on Sid and Nancy?
This one, kind of like All That Jazz, this one I didn't really appreciate till later. And when it comes to movies like this, when it comes to Sid and Nancy, The Doors, Requiem for a Dream to an extent, the topic and subject matter, it takes me a little bit to kind of get past that first viewing and then start paying attention. A lot of those uncomfortable topics, kind of the ickiness that we've discussed before, it takes me a little bit to get past that to really shine the performances and kind of what the filmmakers are going for. This one I actually am a fan of. I think I'm up to my third viewing after this week. And after the third viewing, the performances are what really makes this. We take a young Gary Oldman who does a fantastic job, but the way the ensemble interacts with each other is what makes the magic to this film. Is when we get to the scenery and the cinematography of the city, and even inside the apartment, the way the characters interact with each other in that, it's incredible. So I think this one, for me, the performances make it as a holistic movie. I think there are some flaws here and there, but the standout is going to be the performances and the chemistry between the ensemble.
And just like, it feels punk rock, you know? It doesn't feel like a poser of a movie. We've seen plenty of movies that are total posers of what they're actually trying to represent. You know, they're very glossy and glamorized when they're talking about punk rock, or if they're talking about grunge rock of the 90s. Like, I'm sorry, but Cameron Crowe's Singles is like one of those where I'm just like, this is the glossy Hollywood version of what the grunge culture looks like. Get out of here with your movie. But this one doesn't. This one feels like you're having a heroin binge with Sid and Nancy while someone's holding a 16 millimeter camera. And that's the whole point of it. It's supposed to feel dirty. It's supposed to feel dangerous. And before we move on to the next one, I gotta give appreciation to these guys because they both really love a good music biopic or a musical film that breaks the mold. Like, they put Purple Rain on their top 10. Both of them did for 1984. They're both really big fans of musicians that do films when done right. So usually it's, you know, modern day musicals or films like this, you know, alternative or punk rock biopics, or Penelope Spheeris' Suburbia, movies that like the underground loved but critics didn't. But these guys always stood up for those movies, and I really appreciated that because they don't look like they'd be punk rock enthusiasts, but they appreciate the music and the message that the filmmaker is trying to do when it connects the film with the music genre.
And I think we get into those films, and that's where the multiple watch really come into play, because getting past that point, when you pay for a ticket at that point, walking out, do you want to feel icky? Do you want to be entertained? Those are kind of what we're kind of deciding. And watching the trailer on this one wasn't mismarketed at all. So this one, you kind of knew exactly what you were getting into when walking and buying a ticket. So I 100% that these two really do have a talent for getting past that, and where I may flaw of can't get past that the first viewing. So they will nail a lot of the key points and see past all those emotions and respect it for what it is when it comes to the filmmaking process. So I agree.
My choice for the best film of 1986, Woody Allen's Hannah and Her Sisters, another remarkable achievement for one of America's few individualistic filmmakers who is always breaking new ground. And what I love about this film is I think it's Allen's most optimistic, serious film to date, juggling the lives of more than a half dozen New Yorkers, all searching for someone to love, something to believe in amid the quick pace of that incredible city.
You and I have never really spoken about Woody Allen films. Where do you sit with Woody Allen as a filmmaker?
Hit or miss. A lot of his early stuff where there is some creativity and there is some spark, some bounce in his dialogue, that's where I think he was at his best. The further along he went, the slower the dialogue, the slower the character direction. It seemed like he was showing his time as movies went on. I'm not saying the dialogue was horribly written. I think the movies were a little bit horribly paced, but I think early Alan is really where his forte was, because there was some spark, there was some motivation, there was some magic to how the dialogue and how the characters reacted to that dialogue, especially when we see it in uh, this film here, Hannah and Her Sisters. This one is a prime example of the dialogue bouncing off the characters and Alan at his character direction best.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it makes me kind of want to reference when people say when stand-up comics make it big and they no longer have humor that's relatable to the commonplace and common people. Like Seinfeld made a name for himself, making airplane food jokes and, why does breakfast cereal do this, blah, blah, blah. And then as he started becoming like a multi-millionaire, his comedy became less cohesive with the audience because he no longer lived that lifestyle. And I feel Woody Allen's trajectory is very similar. Like as he gets older, he gets more money, he gets more fame, he gets more weird tastes and desires. You see those, I'm not going to say demons, but you see those quirks start showing themselves and representing themselves in his films. So I agree with you, where early Allen is the best. I'd say the caveat to that is if he's doing something that's like retrofitted. For example, my favorite Woody Allen movie is Radio Days. Because he's essentially telling stories in the past during old-time radio days of different families. Very similar to Hannah and Her Sisters. It's funnier, but it's that same kind of formula. But when he injects himself into the movies and essentially plays himself, that's when I get tired. I kind of get bored with Woody Allen in those moments. So I agree with you on that 100%. But these guys are Woody Allen's age, essentially. They've come up with him in his career. So as his career has progressed, their career has progressed, and I feel like their relatability with what he's trying to say in his movies is more on point with them than it would be for someone like you or me.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And it seems like the messaging got more lost in translation over the years, even though the dialogue went softer, slower, and less interesting. He had a good forte on his dialogue when it was in his early days. And we throw in mixes like Owen Wilson in one of his movies. A lot of these
Right.
contemporary actors, these A-listers to an extent, and they're managed a lot differently than what they had back in the 70s, 80s. So there's a lot of elements that really make some of the current movies just not appeal to, one, the screen likability and audiences, period.
One of the things I like about it is the way that people try to find substitutes for the solidity and stability of a family. Now, there is a family in this movie that's kind of disintegrating, and then there are other people who in other ways have these interconnected relationships, and they meet at Thanksgiving, they meet on holidays where they try to pretend that they're a family, but then they split up into all of their neuroses and all of their problems, and then they try to come back together again for another holiday. It takes place over the course of a year, and this search for that kind of security is at the heart of the film and makes it really interesting.
So what I like about these episodes is a lot of the times they both have the same films in their top 10 list. And you just see like this joy of them being able to talk about something they both like together, where like the need for discourse disappears. And you look at Gene's face and he can just smile and nod and agree with Roger's saying because, well, this movie was on both of their top 10 lists. Like a lot of these movies they both really, really like. And oftentimes there's more on their lists that are the same than there are not. And it's the ones that aren't that those are the films that have deeper discourse.
Absolutely. And this one was a hit with these two this year. And I think the biggest piece of it is not only the smart dialogue and kind of the family element, but the more chaotic element of every character on screen has something interesting to say. All of them have a different quirk. And they never get exhausting to an extent because it's always entertaining. Every cast member here really does have a quirk that we really do want to follow. And it's usually a quirk when it comes to the topic of love and how we relate to each other. some of these relationships are taboo, and we still want to be engulfed into this in almost an innocent way. And that's what I really appreciated, that especially with the Michael Caine is a brilliant performance in this movie.
Yeah.
And I think we see a lot of that human nature shine from his individual character in this, and well-deserved an Academy Award nomination for this performance, because I think he, to an extent, carries the story along just by the topics that he narrates in his head.
Okay, my choice for the best film of 1986 is one that came out at the very end of the year, and it's called Platoon. It was written and directed by Oliver Stone, who served for 18 months in Vietnam and who wanted to make a movie from the viewpoint of the ordinary foot soldier, the combat infantryman.
So one of the things that I noticed as I went through the 80s is that they really, really did like the things that Oliver Stone was doing. And even into the 90s, too. They were champions for JFK when a lot of critics weren't. They were champions for Natural Born Killers when a lot of critics weren't. And they were huge champions of Nixon, which a lot of critics weren't. So these guys were kind of all in on Oliver Stone throughout the 80s and 90s. And this is a film that I think really kicked it off for them. Is he was always a dangerous filmmaker. He was always a avant-garde filmmaker. He was always trying to like be Hollywood as a writer, but as a filmmaker tried to like distance himself from the mainstream because he wanted to tell stories that were a little bit darker, didn't want to put a glossy coat of paint on it. And, you know, Platoon comes out in 86, Full Metal Jacket comes out in 87, and for the longest time it was, which is the better Vietnam film, right? And when we get to Full Metal Jacket, which is a very infamous episode with them, we can have that conversation then. But yeah, I think Platoon is a masterpiece, and it's just really interesting that we've seen them tear apart so many war movies for being scattered and not really focused on a particular character, and that's what this movie kind of is. It's like it has a lot of characters. It does focus specifically on 3, but it lets them appreciate the actual filmmaking magistry that was at work and not like the intention of pulling at heartstrings using a subject as war to win its audience over, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, and using the word dangerous, he was a dangerous director, but in a good way, because he is an honest director when it comes to his intent of what he's trying to portray on screen. We saw it with, like you said, JFK, Nixon, which would be a hard one to portray without putting a personal spin on it. W would be another one. So there's a lot of challenge to the movies he picks, but he does it with the best intent to leave opinion out of it, but to really portray and tell a message and a story that goes along with these characters we see on screen. I've always loved Oliver Stone for that personal trait, because we see a lot of movies now that have to put a personal commentary and gloss over the facts just to get the filmmaker's point of view, so the filmmaker is right. Oliver Stone is that one renegade that really does stick to kind of the facts and have the camera do the work of telling the story and the portrayal of this without making everything look shiny. And Platoon is a masterpiece when it comes. To me, I've always had a problem with war movies. I think a lot of them are well done. I think they're challenging. I think at some points they can be overdone, where we see the same thing in the same style from filmmakers. But Platoon and Full Metal Jacket, a lot of these good films that really tell a dark, gritty story that don't shine away from showing the audience what the dark pieces of this history is what makes these films masterpieces and makes them memorable and makes the message stay current even today.
What I like about Stone, especially in the late 80s and early to mid 90s, is that here was a filmmaker who wasn't trying to protect anybody, right? Like the whole purpose of his film and the way he would tell his stories is to tell you, this is what people are getting away with. Like, this is what your government was getting away with. This is what mainstream media is getting away with. This is what Wall Street is getting away with. And by telling those stories with engaging characters, Charlie Sheen in several of those movies, it really, really worked. It really got people to buy into what he was doing as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, but not necessarily putting on the tinfoil hat all the way, right? It was just enough to have you question what was going on around you and be entertained at the same time. That to me is one of the most challenging skills as a filmmaker to get away with, because they're either going to call you a crackpot or they're going to call you like a provocateur. And somehow he was able to get all of those things in and still make movies and not be like pushed aside into the category of, oh, this guy's a troublemaker, don't give him money to make a movie. If anything, they gave him more money to make more movies, you know?
And even looked on today, I mean, there's a danger in Oliver Stone making movies today because everything is so divided. And that's a whole other topic when it comes to filmmaking today. But there is a respect level for the work that has been done. And I know I've said it numerous times, the appreciation for the cult-worthy is showing these aspects, because these are the type of movies like Platoon that need to stay current. They need to stay present, of taking those chances as a filmmaker and really kind of telling the story of the big, as you brilliantly said, the question mark, just enough to question, just enough to kind of open up your minds to it. Because as time goes on, we don't get a lot of that history lesson, that we don't get a lot of that in films. And that's why these are our cultural gold that we need to hold on to. If I'm going down a rabbit hole.
So let's go ahead and finish this episode off by going through their top 10s, because they only said a few of their top 10 lists. We'll go through their top 10s, and then we'll add the ones that we would have liked to have seen at their top 10 and potentially our personal pick for number 1 of the year. So I'll go ahead and start with Siskel's list. At number 10, he had The Fly. Already heard them talk about it. Number 9, he had Round Midnight. Number 8, Children of a Lesser God. I don't think it belongs on there, but they already had that discourse. He had Platoon at number 7, and this is the one at number 6, which I was really excited about. Blue Velvet. Now, he was a fan of Blue Velvet. Roger was not a fan of Blue Velvet. And when you hear that conversation, it's really interesting because it's almost that flipped narrative where normally you would hear Gene talk about these characters being mean and aggressive and abusive, and the movie's misogynistic. That's usually Gene's talking points. But in that case, it was Roger's talking point, and Gene really appreciated what David Lynch was doing by saying that suburbia and like this middle-class culture is just a facade and that everything is actually ugly underneath. That was the point of the movie. Lynch didn't say that to Gene Siskel. He was smart enough to figure it out. So that was a very interesting pick to put on his number 6. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm on Siskel's side on this one because, again, we run into that same issue from All That Jazz, where in multiple movies, where this one does take multiple watches to kind of get the point. Gene got it right away, Roger not so much. And I think this is one that really had style. It really had substance to it to really carry it along and justify the overlaying tone. So I think when it comes to overall filmmaking, again, I like Blue Velvet. I don't know. It's a little high on the list for that I would put it on mine, but it is a fantastic movie. But I think it is worthy of a top 10 list. But yeah, I think Gene kind of nails it on this one, on Blue Velvet. It's a fantastic film.
I agree with you. I think it is a little bit high, but the fact that it's in the top 10 makes me happy. At number 5, he has Peggy Sue Got Married, which is on both their lists. Ugh, I have a hard time with this one, man. Because it's one that like I remember seeing way too young and not understanding it, so I just let it slip by my mind. And then probably watched it again for real in my 20s. And I'm just not a fan. Like I love Coppola's avant-garde years. Like I like Rumblefish and I like One from the Heart. I think they're really fascinating offbeat movies. Peggy Sue is just a weird middle of the road for me where it's like it's not avant-garde enough to be an art film, but it's not mainstream enough to be a mainstream film. It kind of exists somewhere in the middle. And Kathleen Turner doesn't play the role that I like to see Kathleen Turner play. I think that's my biggest gripe with the movie.
Not a Peggy Sue Got Married fan at all. I thought it was okay, but
it's okay.
Kathleen Turner, I thought, was completely miscast in this, 100%. Even when it's like when she goes back and she's in her normal body, but back in high school, her voice just it's a unique. I love the voice, but it doesn't match here. It's not believable. Her mannerisms going into the high school. There's no wow factor. There's nothing in these characters are explored. This is kind of the one that baffles me on a lot of these reviews, because I will admit it, I don't get it. Because there is nothing here that really screams art house. There's nothing here that screams audience appeasing, or entertainment value. I thought it was okay from start to finish, but there's really nothing memorable for me other than Jim Carrey was in it being a goofball and a horrible side character.
Agreed. And Nicolas Cage doing whatever voice he decided he wanted to do that day.
Oh, man. Yes.
All right. Number 4, Gene's got Mona Lisa. I love that pick. Early Neil Jordan kicks ass. Bob Hoskins kicks ass. Great movie. Number 3, A Room with a View. I'm not saying that Merchant Ivory films aren't good. They're just not my cup of tea, so to speak. They have their audience, they have their crowd, and I'm not one of them. Now, number 2, Vagabond, which we talked about earlier before we recorded, that neither of us had seen, but you recently watched it. He had it at number 2 in his list, so I'm going to go ahead and let you speak to that since you've got more familiarity with it.
Yeah, I mean, I just recently watched it. So this week, I'm grateful for this top 10 list, or else I probably would have never seen it. This is a super hard to find movie to get. But this movie, I think, is well deserved to be top 5. Top 2, I think, is a little high for it. But it is an absolute stunning film when it comes to it. We talk about a lot of the social ickiness. We talk about this girl that goes from start to finish who winds up dead in a ditch. And then we progress through the movie of her just free on the road. And we see not just obstacles, but realistic things that she has to overcome. And she is a strong-willed woman. And we get a lot of these movies that really have kind of the victim. We have this weak female character that we want to feel sorry for. We don't feel sorry for this character, and we feel her strength in it, but she is kind of an angry person, and it really challenges the audience and the character itself to say, you can choose freedom or die of loneliness. And it really challenges and makes you critically think of not just what you see on screen of this character. This character represents us as how we view our life. What would happen if we knew we were going to die in 5 months? Or who in our life have we treated this way, kind of deal. There is a lot to this movie that's simplistic, but it challenges us to really critically think. And I think it's an absolutely stunning movie. And if you haven't watched it, you need to check it out.
I haven't seen it, but from your description, it kind of sounds like the Reese Witherspoon movie Wild. And it also kind of sounds like, was it Into the Wild with Emil Hirsch, where he played Christopher McCandless? Yeah. So yeah, I have to check this out for sure. And then number 1, he had Hannah and Her Sisters, which we already talked about. So on to Roger's list. Number 10, he had the film Hard Choices, which was the other one I did not know anything about. You didn't have a chance to see that one either?
This one I couldn't find anywhere, so this one is a tough one, but it's definitely going to be on my list to watch.
All right, let's put it on our list. We might have to come back to it later. Number 9, he's got Peggy Sue Got Married. Number 8, of course, Down and Out in Beverly Hills. We got to talk about number 7 for a second. So I'm a huge Alan Rudolph fan. And my favorite film of his is Trouble in Mind with Chris Christopherson and Robert Carradine. It is Keith Carradine. It is a crazy, crazy movie. Slightly dystopian, almost like Blade Runner-esque, but it's noirish, yet it also is a very interesting character study. It's just one of those movies of the 80s that you're like, how did they make this? Who made this movie happen? And not only that, it has Divine playing a dude who's essentially a gangster loan shark who dresses like Sidney Greenstreet from the Maltese Falcon. It's just a bonkers performance. It's a bonkers movie. And the fact that Roger had it number 7 on his list, man, it just makes me love that man even more. Like, that's a daring pick to put at number 7. It's going to be on the cult worthy eventually. I'm trying to get a very special guest. It's just a little bit more time and a little bit more caressing before I get him to talk about that movie. Have you seen that one?
So I saw it on the list and I did watch it. I watched it a couple days ago and I did absolutely love it. I love the grittiness. I love Christopherson and I love Divine. I love that scene where they're at the Chinese restaurant.
Yep. It's a great scene.
It's just an all around just unique movie where it feels kind of current, but it feels the characters just kind of make it. You know, I have Christopherson in that black outfit that just is so like screen stealing. So to me, I really did enjoy it. I thought it was unique. It's probably one of the most unique ones on Roger's list. And I think it's the one that should have stood out more to me. That I'm surprised I haven't seen it before, but I'm glad I did because I really did enjoy it.
Great early performance from Joe Morton. And one of my favorite aspects of that movie is that Keith Carradine starts the movie off as like the hero, as the guy that you're supposed to identify with. And he's like a hippie vagabond, right? But throughout the movie, as he gets a little bit more and more climbing up the ladder of the underworld, he gets more and more flamboyant till at the end, he's almost like Adam Ant. He's like a dandy. It's just a great character development, but it goes in reverse. It goes from better to worse. And you don't see a lot of that in movies. So we'll eventually get into that movie eventually on one of these podcasts in a deeper form, but it's a fantastic one. People got to check it out. So we had Vagabond at number 6, Lucas at number 5, Sid and Nancy at number 4, Hannah at number 3, Round Midnight at number 2, and Platoon at number 1. So a lot of crossover between the two of them, but the ones that were not on the crossover list I thought were very fascinating choices. Specifically, Blue Velvet, The Fly, and Trouble in Mind. Like those three right there were just like, you guys were daring on putting those in your top 10, but I stand for it.
100%, because... And Down and Out in Beverly Hills, I'll add that one because that one was kind of out of left field for me. But I think this was a great list. And I think a lot of these had, well, both of them had a good mix of kind of art house versus things that really have the crowd relate to. But there's really not one real unlikable movie on this list, with the exception of Peggy Sue Got Married to me.
Agreed.
I mean, both of them had some really great choices.
All right, so now we're going to talk about what movies we think are missing off of this list for 1986, off the top 10 list, and potentially what our number ones would be. Do you have a short list of films that you think you would have liked to have seen on this top 10 list?
I have two. One's going to be cliche, and one I think is going to be based on total opinion. You either like it or you hate it. Stand By Me is going to be my cliche one, because that one's a go-to.
You bastard, that was on mine too.
And then Down by Law.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good one too. Yeah, I picked two. And the one that, because I already told you before recording that Trouble in Mind was definitely in mine and maybe at the top, but it is very obscure. So for me, I thought Stand By Me definitely should have been on this list. But the one that I would have put not only on the top 10 list, it probably would have been number 1 or 2 between that and Trouble in Mind. And that's Martin Scorsese's Color of Money. Like, I was so flabbergasted that wasn't on either of their lists. It's one of the best edited films of all time. It's one of the best shot films of the 80s for sure. Really just getting that steady cam and those close-ups, just really, really telling that story. But then it's my favorite Tom Cruise performance too. It's at that time where Tom Cruise still felt like a person and not like a movie star, right? And then Paul Newman just coming out of semi-retirement essentially and revising his Fast Eddie character and just blowing people away. There was so much good in that movie that I was so shocked it didn't end up on either of their top 10s. And like I said, it would probably be number 1 or 2 between Trouble in Mind. Like those are my two for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to pick my favorite of 86, and you kind of stole my thunder, Mona Lisa was my favorite of 86 because it's an incredible movie, and Bob Hoskins is absolutely one of my go-tos. So yeah, Mona Lisa is my pick for best of 86.
Okay, man. Well, this was a fantastic conversation. I'm glad that we do these like little special episodes now and then. And we just got to let people know that we are getting back into the swing of things. Next week, we are doing Curtis Hansen's Bad Influence, starring Rob Lowe and James Spader. Thank you for joining me on this very special episode. Everyone, please subscribe, like, review to our show, Back to the Balcony. You can also find me, Antonio, the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast on thecultworthy.com. And Justin, we can find you at
TheMovieWire.com and anywhere you listen to your podcast and socials at Movie Wire Show.
And I do have to give a very special shout out. We got our very first listener recommendation on our YouTube channel today. So Mike has recommended that we cover Godzilla 1985. So we're putting it on the list. We've still got a few movies to get to before we get to it. But Mike, if you're listening, if you're watching, it's on the list and we're going to get to it. So everyone, hit us up on either Twitter, X, Instagram. You can find me in the Cultworthy on Facebook, or leave a comment on our YouTube of what movies you want to see us talk about that Siskel and Ebert reviewed on either At the Movies or Sneak Reviews.
Great recommendation. I can't wait for that conversation. That's going to be amazing.
All right, everyone. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.